Hello everyone and welcome to Workshop 5, Organizing Your Story, What's the Midpoint? And we are going to be working on Act 2 today. Act 2 is that large section in the middle of your novel. The content is about half of your whole novel. And I find that often if your novel is going to go off the rails somewhere, this is going to be where it's going to happen. We tend to lose track of our novel in the center part if we're going to at all. And so one of the great ways to keep track of what's happening to the action in Act 2 is to break it into two sections, and one section is from pivotal point 1 to the midpoint, and the second section is from the midpoint to pivotal point 2. And if we organize it into two sections this way, I find it is more manageable to deal with. Act 2 is held together by conflict. And without any conflict in your novel, your main character is not going to be developing, and therefore neither is your story. And so the conflict and the action needs to be moving through your novel very, very clearly, especially in the second act. And the midpoint of your novel represents your premise. It's actually your premise in action. And you've already outlined your premise, we've already talked about it. And so you already know your pivotal point 1, your midpoint, and your pivotal point 2. So the basic framework for your Act 2 is already there. And what we need to do today in this workshop is to put in the scenes so that you know how the action is going to evolve before your midpoint and after your midpoint to set up the end of your novel. After your pivotal point 1, the beginning of Act 2 should set up what your main character wants to win, gain, or get, or achieve in the rest of your novel. As we said before in an earlier workshop, pivotal point 1 is really the real, true beginning of your story. And so in the beginning of Act 2, you're setting up the rest of your novel. And of course your main point, your midpoint, and then your pivotal point 2 just continue to build upon what you're giving your reader right here at the beginning of Act 2, which is what your story is really going to be all about. In Star Wars A New Hope, this is when Luke decides to stay with Obi-Wan and flies off with Han and Chewbacca and Obi-Wan and the droids, escaping, hopefully, into the universe that he's never seen. So we know that he's not on Tatooine any longer, he has no family left, and he wants to save the princess, which he's wanted to do almost from the very beginning of the film. And so this is the first pivotal point, and the scenes right after that set up where the novel is going. And this is what you need to do with your book here. The midpoint of your novel, as I said, is the premise, and you can see this in action in Star Wars A New Hope. That is the point where Luke rescues Princess Leia with Han and Chewbacca. And that is exactly what the premise of the Star Wars movie is all about. Through his fighting skills, Luke is able to save the princess. So this is a really good way to think of your midpoint and to keep your book on track. The second section of Act 2 in the movie, George Lucas, who wrote it, is the director, sets up to make sure that Luke does free the princess, joins the rebellion, and that they all get away with the plans, the stolen plans for the Death Star. Because if they don't get away with the stolen plans, then there isn't going to be any fight against the Empire. The rebellion will be over right there. So George Lucas was aware of the fact that he had to set up scenes that moved on to pivotal point 2, which was Luke joining the rebellion in earnest and flying the starship to try and defeat the Empire. And so this is what the assignments that I've given you for this week are going to allow you to do the same things as last week with Act 2, to set up your scenes to make sure that you are supporting your pivotal points and your midpoint of your novel. And it's a great way to keep your novel on track. I can't emphasize this enough. Setting up your scenes and knowing exactly where your novel is going is a great way to keep your main character consistent, keep the action flowing, and to keep your reader interested. By the end of this week's workshop, you're going to have 28 cards that are going to represent the scenes in the middle part on about half of your novel. And if you take those cards, once you've gone through them and you've organized them and you've set them up the way that you want them to be, if you take those 28 cards and you add in the 14 cards from Act 1 and the 14 cards from Act 3, you will have your whole novel organized out in scenes in front of you. And I think this is an invaluable tool to look in on your book from the outside and make sure that it is moving the way that you want it to move and that your main character is developing the way that you want them to develop. So at the end of this workshop this week, you'll have those 28 cards from this week and the 28 cards from last week. So you've got 56 cards to work with, to move around, to play with, and that's your novel right there in a nutshell. And I think it's really exciting. So I'll see you all back here again next week for our final workshop, which is going to be talking about the ending of your book and also talking about some character development that's possible in your novel as well. So I'm looking forward to seeing you all here again next week for the last week's workshop. And thank you very much for being here with me again this week. Have a great week, everyone, and see you next week.